The Familiar Curse of Pumpkin Paws. A cozy Halloween tale of curses, companions, and midnight mischief. By Win Valentine. Copyright 2025 by Win Valentine. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced in any form or by any electronic or mechanical means, including information storage and retrieval systems, without written permission from the author, except for the use of brief quotations in a book review. This novel is entirely a work of fiction. The names, characters, and incidents portrayed in it are the work of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events or localities is entirely coincidental. Win Valentine asserts the moral right to be identified as the author of this work. Designations used by companies to distinguish their products are often claimed as trademarks. All brand names and product names used in this book and on its cover are trade names, service marks, trademarks, and registered trademarks of their respective owners. The publishers in the book are not associated with any product or vendor mentioned in this book. None of the companies referenced within the book have endorsed the book. Book cover by Dana Sacco. Introduction. Every spell begins with a spark of inspiration, and mine came from my youngest daughter, Lupita. She has a gift for bringing a little mischief and a lot of magic to life with her hands, and this story wouldn't exist without her creativity. Lupita has stitched that same spirit into an enchanted plushie, soft, snuggly, and just a little bit bewitched. You can find it at her Etsy shop, Cozyhooksss. Best of all, when you adopt one of her plushies, you'll also receive a paperback copy of this book, because every magical companion deserves a story to curl up with. Thank you for stepping into our family's world of stories and stitches. May the pages ahead bring you pumpkin bright joy and a few cozy shivers.
Chapter 1. The Costume Catastrophe. If there was one thing I despised more than the screeching sound of Marnie's enchanted tea kettle at dawn, it was the unholy cacophony she called singing while she worked her magic. Today, both were competing for the honor of making my ears bleed, as I perched on my favorite windowsill, watching the maple leaves spiral down in shades of amber and crimson. "Oh, Whiskers!" Marnie's voice rang out from her workshop, sweet as poisoned honey. "Come see what I've made for you." I flicked my tail once, a universal feline expression meaning absolutely not, and settled deeper into the patch of autumn sunlight. Outside, Gossamer Grove was already buzzing with pre-fair excitement. Mrs. Thornberry was hanging enchanted cobwebs from her porch that sparkled with genuine dewdrops, and I could smell the warm spice of Mr. Chen's magical cider brewing 3 blocks away. The whole town had been in a tizzy for weeks about today's familiar fair, the annual Halloween celebration where witches showed off their familiars like prized show ponies. Naturally, I wanted no part of it. "Whiskers, my grumpy Whiskers." Marnie's voice carried a dangerous sing-song quality that made my fur stand on end. "Don't make me come get you." My grumpy Whiskers. I closed my eyes and counted to 10 in ancient Latin, a meditation technique I'd learned from a very wise barn owl. It didn't work. My ears were still ringing with the indignity of that ridiculous nickname, and now I could hear her footsteps approaching. I tried to project my thoughts to her through our familiar bond, a sharp, clear message of "this is a terrible idea," but the telepathic connection felt like trying to shout through cotton. Our mental link had been unreliable for days now, ever since she'd started experimenting with what she cheerfully called seasonal enhancement spells. The thing about familiar telepathy was that it required emotional resonance and mutual focus from both parties. When Marnie got excited about spellcasting, which was most of the time lately, her magical attention scattered like startled sparrows and our connection frayed at the edges. What should have been my crystal-clear objection came through as nothing more than a vague sense of unease that she would undoubtedly dismiss as pre-costume jitters. "There you are, my magnificent familiar." She appeared in the doorway, wearing her favorite autumn dress, the one covered in dancing leaves that actually danced, and holding something behind her back. I've been working all morning on the most wonderful surprise. I opened one green eye and fixed her with my most withering stare. The mental connection flickered for just a moment, long enough for me to attempt projecting, "Whatever it is, the answer is no," but Marnie's excitement was already pulling her attention toward whatever catastrophe she had planned, and my thoughts dissolved into background static. "Look!" She whipped her hands from behind her back with a flourish, revealing what could only be described as the most horrifying assault on good taste I'd ever seen. It was a costume, for me, made of what appeared to be enchanted felt in violent shades of orange and green, complete with a jack-o'-lantern headpiece that grinned with an enthusiasm I found personally offensive. Tiny bells were sewn around the collar, bells that were already jingling with barely contained magical energy. I stared at the abomination for a full 30 seconds before delivering my verdict. A single, decisive murrow that roughly translated to, "I would rather be turned into a newt." "Oh, don't be such a drama cat," Marnie laughed, setting the costume down on the coffee table, where it seemed to glow with smug satisfaction. "The familiar fair costume contest is the highlight of the whole festival, and this year we're going to win." I attempted once more to reach her through our bond, this time focusing all my emotional energy into a single, desperate plea. "Please, Marnie, listen to me. This is not what I want." For a brief moment, I felt the connection solidify, felt her magical attention turn toward me with recognition. But then she was already moving on, her excitement building as she pulled out her favorite wand, the one carved from apple wood and topped with a crystal that looked suspiciously like a disco ball, and our mental link scattered like dandelion seeds in the wind. "I've been perfecting the enchantment for weeks," she continued, apparently oblivious to my attempted telepathic intervention. "The pumpkin head will give you the most adorable little round silhouette, and the bells will chime in harmony with whatever you're feeling. It's emotionally responsive magic." What came through to her instead of my specific objections was probably just a general sense of familiar nervousness, the kind any witch might expect from a familiar on contest day. I watched her face and saw exactly the moment she dismissed whatever faint unease she'd picked up from our bond, attributing it to nothing more than pre-performance jitters. I leapt down from the windowsill and stalked to the far side of the room, every line of my body screaming rejection. "And," Marnie added with the kind of smile that usually preceded my worst days, "I've already entered us in the competition." The betrayal hit me like a hex to the stomach. I spun around and yowled my outrage at maximum volume, a sound that sent the ceramic jack-o'-lanterns on the mantel rattling and made the enchanted portrait of Great-Aunt Cordelia cover her painted ears. Now, Marnie said, advancing with the costume. "It's just for one day, and think of all the attention we'll get. The whole town will see how magnificent you are." But Marnie's magical focus was already completely absorbed by the spell she was preparing to cast. Our telepathic bond might as well have been severed entirely. She was close enough now that I could smell the magic radiating from the costume, sweet and spicy like candied apples, with an underlying current that made my whiskers twitch uneasily. Binding magic. The kind that wouldn't come off until the spell was properly released. "Come on, Whiskers," she coaxed, holding up the pumpkin headpiece. "Just try it on. If you really hate it, we can make adjustments." I backed toward the bookshelf, every instinct screaming danger. The costume was practically humming with magical energy now, and Marnie's eyes had taken on that glassy, focused look she got when she was channeling power. This wasn't a simple dress-up game anymore. This was a full enchantment in progress, and her magical attention was so completely absorbed by the spell work that our familiar bond had gone completely silent. "By the power of autumn's heart and harvest moon's light," she began, and I realized with growing horror that she was casting the binding spell without me even touching the cursed thing. Let this costume grant its wearer sight. I couldn't let her finish whatever ridiculous rhyming couplet she was building toward. The whole thing was preposterous, undignified, and completely beneath my station as a sophisticated, magical familiar. And if I couldn't reach her through our telepathic connection, I would just have to use my voice. "This is the most ridiculous excuse for magic I've ever witnessed," I declared aloud, my voice crackling with indignation. "Honestly, Marnie, emotional bells? A pumpkin head? What's next? A tail that wags when I'm happy? The entire concept is an insult to familiar kind everywhere. I wouldn't be caught dead in that orange monstrosity, and if you think for 1 second that I'm going to prance around town looking like some kind of demented jack-o'-lantern mascot just so you can win a ribbon, you've got another—" The magic hit me mid-rant. It started as a warm tingling in my paws, like stepping on a carpet after walking through enchanted snow. Then the sensation spread upward, wrapping around my legs, my torso, my neck, until every inch of my fur was crackling with orange and green sparks. "Thing coming," I finished weakly. But my voice sounded strange, muffled, distant. I looked down at my paws and felt my heart stop. They were orange, not orange fur, orange felt, stubby, round, and utterly ridiculous orange felt paws that looked like they belonged on a child's toy. "Oh my," Marnie whispered, and I could hear the first note of panic creeping into her voice. I tried to speak, to demand an immediate reversal, and was relieved when actual words came out, though they sounded oddly muffled, like speaking through a jack-o'-lantern mask. Which, I supposed, with growing horror, I technically was. "Marnie," I said, my voice pitched higher than usual and carrying an unfortunate squeaky quality, "reverse this spell immediately." The room spun slightly as I struggled to process what was happening. I stumbled to the antique mirror by the fireplace and nearly fainted at what I saw staring back. My reflection showed a plush cat, still recognizably me, but rendered in soft felt and stuffing instead of fur and muscle. My head had been replaced by a grinning jack-o'-lantern face with triangle eyes and a crooked smile that looked far too cheerful for my current emotional state. The bells around my neck jingled softly with what I was beginning to suspect was barely contained hysteria. I was adorable, absolutely, completely, horrifyingly adorable. I tried desperately to reach Marnie through our telepathic bond, to project the full scope of my distress and demand immediate assistance. But the transformation seemed to have affected even that connection. Instead of our usual clear mental communication, I felt only a strange, muffled echo, as if my thoughts were trying to travel through the stuffing that now comprised my body. "Whiskers?" She knelt down beside me, and I could see my round jack-o'-lantern reflection in her wide, worried eyes. "You can still talk? Oh, thank goodness, I was worried the spell might have—" "Worried about my voice?" I interrupted, my words slightly muffled, but perfectly comprehensible. "What about the rest of me? I'm a plush toy, Marnie." I tried to communicate my extreme not-okayness through our bond, pushing all my panic and outrage toward her consciousness, but it felt like trying to shout through a pillow. What little got through would probably register as nothing more than general familiar distress, easily dismissed as adjustment anxiety. The bells chimed a little tune that sounded suspiciously like jingle bells. "Oh no," Marnie breathed. "Oh no, oh no, oh no, this wasn't supposed to happen. The spell was just supposed to make the costumes stick till midnight, not... I tried to use my magic to break the enchantment myself, reaching for the familiar warmth of my fire glamours. Nothing. My shadow blinking abilities? Gone. Even my foolproof spell for knocking things off high shelves seemed to have vanished along with my corporeal form. The costume had somehow become me, and I was trapped inside it like the world's most mortifying prison. Marnie was pacing now, her wand sparking with nervous energy. Okay, this is fine, this is totally fine, it's just a little magical hiccup. These things happen. Remember when I accidentally turned your food bowl into a singing fish for 3 days? or when I made all the houseplants start gossiping about the neighbors. This is just a slightly bigger hiccup. I waddled over to her feet and looked up at her with what I hoped was a menacing stare, though the effect was somewhat diminished by my permanent jack-o'-lantern grin. The situation is not fine, Marnie. I am a stuffed animal with bells. Do you understand the magnitude of this catastrophe? Don't worry, my magnificent familiar, she said, though her voice was shaking slightly. I'll figure this out. I just need to research some reversal spells and maybe call Aunt Cordelia. She'll know what to do. She bent down and scooped me up, and I was mortified to discover that being held in plush form was actually quite comfortable. My new body was perfectly weighted for cuddling, which was perhaps the most devastating part of this entire catastrophe. Besides, Marnie continued, carrying me toward the workshop, you do look absolutely adorable. If we can't reverse it right away, Lise will definitely win the costume contest. The bells around my neck chimed what sounded distinctly like a funeral dirge. As she settled me on her workbench and began frantically pulling spellbooks from the shelves, I caught sight of myself in the workshop's enchanted mirror, the one that always showed things slightly more dramatically than they really were. My reflection looked like something from a magical toy store's premium collection, perfectly stitched, irresistibly huggable, and wearing an expression of perpetual jack-o'-lantern joy that made me want to claw something. I watched Marnie flip through page after page of spellbooks, muttering to herself about binding reversals and temporary enchantment theory, and tried to ignore the growing certainty that this day was about to get much worse. Outside the workshop window, I could hear the sounds of the familiar fair beginning, the cheerful chaos of a town-wide celebration that I was now doomed to experience as a walking, jingling advertisement for everything I despised about costume contests.
Chapter 2.
Pause, potions, and denial. The enchanted radio was playing a cheerful autumn melody as I hummed along, carefully measuring out powdered moonstone for my latest batch of shimmer gloss lip balm. The familiar fair was in full swing outside, and I could hear the cheerful chaos of setup. The melodic chiming of wind chimes that actually controlled the weather, the gentle whoosh of levitating banners unfurling, and the distant laughter of children already high on carnival cotton candy that sparkled with edible glitter. Perfect weather for the biggest day of the year. "Whiskers, darling," I called toward the living room where my magnificent familiar was sulking on his favorite cushion. "We need to get moving soon. The registration for the costume contest closes at noon, and I still need to pick up supplies from the Cozyhooksss cafe." A distinctly grumpy squeak emerged from the other room. "I am not leaving this house looking like a demented jack-o'-lantern mascot." I rolled my eyes fondly. Honestly, he was being such a drama cat about the whole thing. Yes, the transformation spell had been a tiny bit more comprehensive than I'd intended, but the effect was absolutely adorable. And temporary? Probably. I was reasonably certain the enchantment would wear off by midnight. That's how these seasonal spells usually worked. "It's just until tonight," I called back, capping the lip balm and sliding it into my canvas tote bag alongside my other fair essentials. "Besides, you look absolutely precious. Mrs. Holloway is going to positively melt when she sees you." "I refuse to be melted over," came the muffled reply, followed by what sounded like him burrowing deeper into the cushions. I finished gathering my supplies: enchanted thread for last-minute costume repairs, a thermos of pumpkin spice tea that actually tasted like autumn leaves, and my emergency kit of magical band-aids. The fair was our biggest event of the year, and I'd been looking forward to it for months. This was going to be the year we finally won something. "Come on, my magnificent familiar," I sang out, heading toward the living room. "Adventure awaits." I found Whiskers exactly where I'd expected, curled into the tightest ball possible on his velvet cushion, his jack-o'-lantern head barely visible beneath his stubby orange paws. The picture of feline indignation, if felines were made of felt and stuffing. Absolutely not, he declared without looking up. I am not going out there where people can see me like this. But you look so cute, I protested, kneeling down beside his cushion. And think of all the attention we'll get. Everyone will want to know how I managed such a perfect transformation spell. His jack-o'-lantern face turned toward me, and even though the expression was frozen in a cheerful grin, I could practically feel his glare. That's exactly what I'm afraid of. I reached out to pet his soft felt fur, and despite his protests, he didn't pull away. It's just one day, Whiskers. One magical, wonderful day where we can show everyone what an amazing team we are. We are not a team, he squeaked, though he was purring, a sound that came out like a tiny motor running inside a pillow. We are a witch, and her long-suffering familiar who has been transformed into a children's toy against his will. A very handsome children's toy, I corrected, scooping him up despite his half-hearted wriggling. Now come on, the fair won't wait for us. Stepping outside was like walking into a living storybook. Gossamer Grove had transformed overnight into an autumn wonderland that sparkled with more than just morning dew. The main street was lined with booths draped in enchanted fabrics that shifted from deep burgundy to golden amber depending on the angle of the light. Jack-o'-lanterns bobbed through the air like orange balloons, their carved faces animated and chattering excitedly about the day's events. The scent of cinnamon and magic hung thick in the air, mixing with the earthy smell of fresh hay bales and the sweet smoke from Mrs. Chen's kettle corn stand. Her corn popped in tiny fireworks of color, orange, purple, and green kernels that tasted like different autumn spices. Oh, Marnie! Mrs. Holloway appeared at my elbow as if she'd been waiting for us, her silver hair crowned with a wreath of tiny pumpkins that glowed like fairy lights. And who is this absolutely precious little... Oh, my stars, is that Whiskers? I beamed with pride, holding my familiar a little higher so she could get a better look. Isn't he just perfect? I've been working on the transformation spell for weeks. Madam, Whiskers said with as much dignity as his squeaky voice could muster, I am suffering from a temporary magical malfunction, not a fashion statement. Mrs. Holloway's eyes went wide with delight. Oh, he's even more charming than usual. And that little voice. Harold, you simply must come see this. Before I could stop her, she was calling over half the street, and within moments we were surrounded by a small crowd of cooing neighbors. Mrs. Chen abandoned her kettle corn to get a closer look. The Blackthorn twins materialized from their tarot reading booth, leaving a line of customers waiting. Even grumpy Mr. Grimsby emerged from his cursed antiques shop, though he tried to pretend he was just checking on his sidewalk display of haunted music boxes. Oh my goodness, he's like a little stuffed animal, squealed Jenny Chen, who couldn't have been more than 8 and was already sticky with purple kettle corn. Can I pet him? Absolutely not, Whiskers declared, but his protest was lost in the general chorus of ahs that erupted from the crowd. I was in heaven. This was exactly the kind of attention I'd been dreaming of, everyone admiring my magical handiwork, asking questions about the spell mechanics, wondering if I could do similar transformations for their own familiars. I launched into a detailed explanation of seasonal enchantment theory, while Whiskers grew increasingly rigid in my arms. The key, I was saying to Mrs. Holloway and a rapidly expanding audience, is layering the transformation magic with emotional resonance spells. That's why his little bells chime with his feelings. As if to demonstrate, the bells around Whiskers' neck chimed a distinctly ominous tune that sounded like the musical equivalent of storm clouds gathering. Marnie, he said quietly, I would like to go home now. But I was too caught up in the moment to pay attention to his request. And the best part is how the spell automatically adjusts to maintain his personality. He's still our grumpy, dignified Whiskers, just in the most adorable package. The crowd laughed appreciatively, and someone started taking pictures with an enchanted camera. Whiskers would probably glow orange and green in the photos. Absolutely perfect for our contest entry. Marnie, Whiskers tried again, his voice taking on a slightly desperate edge. I really think we should... Oh, we simply must get going, I announced to the crowd, suddenly remembering my shopping list. So much to do before the contest, but you'll all see us on stage tonight, won't you? A chorus of agreement followed us as I practically bounced toward the Cozyhooksss cafe, Whiskers clutched securely in my arms. I was so energized by the positive response that I barely noticed how stiff he'd gone or how his purring had stopped entirely. The cafe was bustling with pre-fair activity, the air thick with the scent of enchanted pastries and the gentle hum of caffeine-based magic. Ivy Thornberry waved from behind the counter, her usual morning glory hair wreath replaced with tiny autumn leaves that rustled when she moved. Marnie, and oh my goodness, is that Whiskers? She leaned over the counter for a better look, nearly knocking over a display of mood-responsive tea bags. He's absolutely precious. Did you do that transformation yourself? Guilty as charged. I set Whiskers on the counter so Ivy could get a better look, ignoring his quiet sound of protest. Isn't he just perfect for the costume contest? Ivy reached out to pet his soft felt ears, and I was surprised when Whiskers didn't pull away. Maybe he was finally starting to enjoy the attention. He's so soft, Ivy cooed. And look at that little face. Harold is going to die when he sees this. He's been trying to get Minerva to wear so much as a bow tie for the contest, and here you've managed a full transformation. It's all about understanding your familiar's essential nature, I explained, pulling out my phone to take a picture of Whiskers sitting on the counter like the world's most dignified plush toy. Whiskers might complain, but deep down, he loves being the center of attention. I do not, Whiskers squeaked, but his protest was half-hearted at best. 2 disappointment cookies and a large truth tea coming right up, Ivy announced, bustling around the cafe with practiced efficiency. Oh, and here. She reached under the counter and produced a small paper bag that smelled like cinnamon and mischief. Complimentary familiar treats. They're spelled to taste like whatever your familiar loves most. I accepted the treats with a grateful smile, then looked around for Whiskers to see if he wanted to try one. But the counter where I'd left him was empty. Whiskers? I spun in a circle, scanning the crowded cafe. Whiskers? Where did you... A crash from the direction of the pastry display answered my question. I rushed over to find an elaborate tower of enchanted cupcakes scattered across the floor, their magical sprinkles fizzing and popping like tiny fireworks. In the middle of the chaos sat one very innocent-looking plush cat. Whiskers, I scolded, though I was trying not to laugh. What has gotten into you? It was an accident, he said primly, though I could see a few rebellious sprinkles clinging to his felt fur. This body is difficult to navigate. Ivy appeared with a cleanup cloth that sparkled with self-activating cleaning spells. Oh, don't worry about it. Happens all the time during fair season. The magic in the air makes everyone a little more kinetic. I gathered Whiskers back into my arms, noting that he felt a bit warmer than before. Was that normal for transformation spells? I made a mental note to double-check the theoretical framework when we got home. Maybe later, after we'd won the contest and I'd had time to properly celebrate. Come on, troublemaker, I murmured into his soft felt ear. Let's go pick up my thread from the enchanted needle, and then we can head home to get ready for tonight. As we prepared to leave, Ivy wiped her hands on her apron and gave me a thoughtful look. Marnie, dear, can I ask you something? Of course. Has Whiskers been eating normally today? He seems a bit, I don't know, restless? My grandmother always said that when familiars start acting out, it usually means they're trying to tell you something important. I glanced down at Whiskers, who had gone very still in my arms. "Oh, he's just excited about the contest. You know how he gets when there's a lot of magical energy in the air. Right, Whiskers." Before he could respond, I was already heading for the door, eager to continue our errands. Our next stop was Thornwick's Magical Haberdashery, where I needed to pick up some special thread for last-minute costume adjustments. The shop was busy with other contestants making final preparations, and I fell into conversation with Martha Blackthorne about the technical aspects of familiar transformation spells. I set Whiskers down on the counter while I examined spools of enchanted thread, and that's when things got interesting. At first, I thought he was just exploring the counter space, but as I watched out of the corner of my eye while discussing thread tensile strength with Martha, I noticed that Whiskers seemed to be moving with unusual purpose. He nudged a small display of buttons to one side, then pushed a spool of ribbon to another spot, then carefully positioned a pair of tiny scissors in what appeared to be a very deliberate arrangement. "How clever!" Martha exclaimed, noticing his activities. "Look, Marnie, he's playing with the supplies. He's made a little pattern." I looked more closely at what Whiskers had arranged and felt a warm rush of affection. "Oh, that's so sweet. He's trying to help with the crafting. Look how he's lined everything up so neatly." Whiskers froze for a moment, staring at his arrangement, then let out a sound of pure frustration. He began moving more frantically, pushing the items into different configurations, his bells chiming with urgency. He squeaked as he positioned a small wooden letter from Martha's monogram display. E-L-P. "Oh my goodness," Martha said, clapping her hands in delight. "He's spelling." "How absolutely precious. Marnie, your familiar is trying to spell something." I leaned in to look at the letters he'd arranged. H-E-L-P. "Help!" I read aloud, then laughed. "Oh, Whiskers, are you offering to help me with the sewing tonight? That's so thoughtful, but I don't think your little paws could manage the needlework in that form." Whiskers stared at me for a long moment, then deliberately knocked all the letters off the counter with a sweep of his stubby arm. They clattered to the floor while his bells chimed what sounded remarkably like a scream of exasperation. "Drama cat," I said fondly, scooping him up again. "Come on, let's get that thread and head to the flower shop. I want to pick up some fresh autumn leaves for your collar. They'll look lovely with the orange felt." As we left the haberdashery, I caught a glimpse of Mrs. Holloway through the window, watching us with a thoughtful frown. She raised her hand as if to wave us over, but I was already heading down the street, too focused on my growing to-do list to notice. The flower shop was our next stop, and here Whiskers seemed to grow even more agitated. While I discussed seasonal arrangements with Mrs. Willowbottom, he managed to escape my arms and began what could only be described as an elaborate pantomime performance. First, he stood on his hind legs and began making exaggerated gestures with his front paws, pointing at himself, then at me, then shaking his head vigorously. His bells chimed in sharp staccato bursts. "Oh, look!" Mrs. Willowbottom exclaimed with delight. "He's dancing! How absolutely charming!" Whiskers paused in his gesturing and stared at her with barely contained horror. Then he tried a different approach. He lay down on his back, paws in the air, and began making what appeared to be distress signals. "Playing dead," I said, laughing. "Whiskers, you're such a little performer. No wonder everyone's so charmed by you." He rolled over and began frantically pawing at his collar, trying to point at the bells while making increasingly urgent squeaking sounds. "He wants us to listen to his bells," Mrs. Willowbottom interpreted. "How sweet. He knows they're magical." "Exactly," I agreed, though I was starting to feel a tiny flicker of confusion about his behavior. "He's just so proud of the enchantment work. Aren't you, my magnificent familiar?" Whiskers looked up at me with his jack-o'-lantern face, and for just a moment I could have sworn I saw desperation in his triangle eyes. But then Mrs. Willowbottom was showing me a particularly lovely arrangement of enchanted maple leaves, and I got distracted by the way they shimmered with captured moonlight. By the time we left the flower shop, Whiskers had gone completely silent. It was as we were walking home that we encountered Mrs. Holloway again, this time accompanied by her sister Cordelia, who had a reputation for being one of the most observant witches in Gossamer Grove. "Marnie, dear," Mrs. Holloway called out, slightly out of breath as if she'd been hurrying to catch up with us. "I've been wanting to have a word with you." Of course. I paused under the enchanted street lamp, which immediately began glowing with warm, welcoming light. "What can I do for you?" Mrs. Holloway glanced down at Whiskers, who was sitting very still in my arms, then back at my face. I couldn't help but notice earlier, and again just now at the flower shop. Whiskers seems to be trying very hard to communicate something specific. "Oh, he's just excited about the contest," I said brightly. "All that magical energy in the air, you know how it affects familiars." Cordelia said, studying Whiskers with sharp eyes. "Sister, doesn't his behavior remind you of that incident with the Pembertons' cat last spring, when poor Mittens was trying to tell them about the gas leak in their cellar?" Mrs. Holloway nodded thoughtfully. "It does, rather. All that frantic gesturing and trying to spell out messages." I felt a flicker of unease, but pushed it aside. Whiskers was fine. A little stressed about the contest, maybe, but fine. "I appreciate your concern, but really, he's just being his usual dramatic self. You know how Whiskers likes to be the center of attention." I looked down at my familiar, expecting him to protest this characterization, but he was staring up at Mrs. Holloway and Cordelia with an expression that almost looked hopeful. "The thing is, dear," Mrs. Holloway said gently, "when I was watching you at the flower shop, it really looked like he was trying to ask for help. And that business with the letters at Martha's shop." "He was just playing," I insisted, though something in the back of my mind was starting to whisper that maybe, possibly, there was more to this than I'd been willing to see. Cordelia stepped closer, her voice kind but serious. "Marnie, transformation spells can be quite traumatic for familiars, especially if they're not fully consensual. Sometimes the magical bond gets a bit fuzzy, and communication becomes difficult." "But he can still talk," I pointed out. "He's been talking all day." "Yes, but has he been able to talk about what he actually needs?" Mrs. Holloway asked. "Sometimes the magic creates a sort of filter. The familiar can speak, but only about certain topics, or only in ways that the witch expects to hear." I looked down at Whiskers, really looked at him, and felt my chest tighten with the first stirrings of genuine worry. His little plush body was trembling slightly, and his bells were chiming a soft, continuous melody that sounded suspiciously like a plea. "Whiskers?" I said quietly. Are you trying to tell me something important?" He nodded vigorously, his entire body moving with the force of his agreement. "And I've been missing it?" Another nod, this one somehow conveying both relief and exhaustion. The weight of realization hit me like a spell gone wrong. All day, I'd been so caught up in the excitement of showing off my magical work that I'd completely failed to notice that my familiar, my partner, my best friend, had been desperately trying to communicate that something was wrong. "Oh, Whiskers," I whispered, my voice thick with guilt. "I'm so sorry. I've been a terrible witch, haven't I?" His response was immediate and heartbreaking. He nuzzled against my hand with his soft felt head, purring in a way that sounded like forgiveness mixed with relief. "What do you need?" I asked. "How can I help?" But before he could attempt an answer, Mrs. Holloway was already pulling out her pocket watch. "Oh, my stars. Is that the time? Marnie, dear, you'd better get home and start preparing for the contest. The registration closes in less than an hour." The mention of the contest sent a jolt of panic through me. I'd been so focused on errands that I'd lost track of time, and now we were cutting it dangerously close to the deadline. You're right, I said, though part of me wanted to stay and have a proper conversation with Whiskers right there on the street. But after the contest, we're going to sit down and have a real talk, okay? No more misunderstandings. Whiskers looked up at me with what might have been hope, then settled into my arms with a resigned little sigh. As we hurried home through the increasingly busy fair preparations, I found myself seeing the day's events in a completely different light. The cupcake incident at the cafe, the frantic letter arranging at the haberdashery, the desperate pantomiming at the flower shop. All of it had been Whiskers trying to tell me something important, and I'd been too wrapped up in my own excitement to listen. I'm going to do better, I promised him quietly as we reached our front door. I'm going to be the kind of witch who actually pays attention to what her familiar needs. His bells chimed what sounded like cautious optimism, and I felt a flicker of hope that maybe we could still salvage this day.
Chapter 3.
The Mirror Lies. The moment Marnie disappeared into her afternoon nap, a pre-fair tradition, she claimed helped her center her magical energy, but which I suspected was really just an excuse to avoid the pre-contest jitters, I made my move. Escaping the house in my current condition proved more challenging than anticipated. My new plush body was surprisingly bouncy, which meant that my usual graceful leap from the windowsill to the garden became more of an undignified tumble into Mrs. Holloway's prize-winning chrysanthemums. The flowers, enchanted to respond to magical disturbances, immediately began chiming in harmonious concern. "Shh, shh," I whispered urgently, my squeaky voice doing nothing to calm their botanical anxiety. "I'm fine, just temporarily compromised." The chrysanthemums settled into worried murmurs, and I picked myself up with as much dignity as a stuffed cat could muster. My bells jingled softly with determination. At least, I hoped it was determination and not barely contained panic. The familiar fair was in full swing around me, but I kept to the shadows between booths, avoiding the main thoroughfares where Marnie's admirers might spot me and want another round of cooing and petting. The afternoon sun cast long shadows that provided perfect cover for a small orange figure determined to solve his own problems. I had a plan. Sort of. The enchanted Mirror Emporium sat at the far end of Gossamer Grove's main street, tucked between Madame Zelda's crystal ball cleaning service and a shop that sold exclusively left-handed wands. It was the kind of place most sensible magical creatures avoided, which made it perfect for my purposes. The building itself seemed to shift and shimmer as I approached, its walls covered in mirrors of every conceivable shape and size. Some showed normal reflections, while others revealed your deepest fears, your greatest desires, or what you'd look like as a different species entirely. The brass nameplate by the door read, "Miriam Blackglass, proprietor of Problematic Reflections." I'd been here once before, years ago, when Marnie had been cursed with a particularly stubborn case of backward speech after insulting a travelling hedge witch's pronunciation. The experience had been unpleasant enough that I'd sworn never to return, but desperate times called for desperate measures. The door was propped open with a doorstop shaped like a tiny gargoyle that watched me suspiciously as I waddled past. Inside, the shop was a maze of mirrors that created an infinite kaleidoscope of plush orange cats wherever I looked. The effect was deeply unsettling. "Well, well," came a voice from somewhere in the mirrored depths. "What have we here?" Miriam Blackglass emerged from behind a particularly ornate mirror framed in what looked like crystallized moonlight. She was exactly as I remembered, tall, pale, and sharp-featured, with silver hair that moved like liquid mercury and eyes that reflected whatever they looked at. Currently, they were reflecting multiple tiny versions of my humiliating plush form. "Whiskers," she said, and her voice carried the slight echo that all mirror magic practitioners developed after years of talking to reflections. "How diminished you look." "It's a temporary condition," I said firmly. though the squeaky quality of my voice somewhat undermined my attempt at dignity. I need information about curse reversal. She circled me slowly, her reflection multiplying in the surrounding mirrors until I was surrounded by dozens of Miriam black glasses, all wearing identical expressions of amused disdain. Curse reversal? How deliciously specific. And what makes you think I have information about such things? Because you deal in problematic reflections, I replied, trying to keep track of which Miriam was the real one. And I imagine you've seen plenty of magical mishaps over the years. Oh, I have indeed. She gestured toward a mirror in an ornate black frame, its surface swirling with dark mist. That one there shows the true consequences of magical arrogance. This one, she indicated a mirror shaped like a crescent moon, reflects only the lies people tell themselves. And this beauty, her hand moved to a mirror that seemed to be made of liquid silver, shows you exactly what you don't want to see. I studied the mirrors with growing unease. Each one seemed to pulse with its own malevolent energy, and I was beginning to suspect that coming here had been a terrible mistake. I don't need to see anything, I said carefully. I just need to know how to break a transformation curse that was triggered by magical feedback during a binding spell. Ah. Miriam's smile was sharp as broken glass. A self-inflicted curse, the most delicious kind. She paused, studying me with those reflective eyes. You should understand something about transformation magic, little cat. When a familiar's own emotions trigger the curse, when the magic responds to rejection or resistance, it creates a very specific type of binding. She moved closer, her voice taking on the tone of someone explaining a particularly interesting puzzle. Self-inflicted curses triggered by emotional rejection of magic require emotional acceptance to break. The magic responds to the familiar's heart, not just spell components. You can't simply reverse the incantation. You have to address what caused the magical feedback in the first place. Which was what, exactly? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Your rejection of the spell, your resistance to what your witch was trying to create. The magic fed on that negative emotional energy and became self-sustaining. She gestured to a mirror I hadn't noticed before, a simple rectangular glass in a frame that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of obsidian. This one specializes in such cases. The mirror's surface was perfectly black, like looking into a pool of ink. As I watched, silvery words began to appear in flowing script. The familiar seeks what pride forbids, to break what arrogance builds, speak truth to lies and lies to truth, and find what comfort never yields. That's not helpful at all, I protested, my bells chiming with frustration. It's just cryptic nonsense. Is it? Miriam leaned closer to the mirror, and more words appeared. Break what you won't say to earn what you won't wear. 3 gifts to give what you won't share. A reflection that lies a misfit's favor. 3 words of praise for what you won't savor. I stared at the riddle, my plush mind working frantically to decode its meaning. Break what I won't say. 3 words of praise. A horrible suspicion began to form in my stuffed consciousness. You're talking about compliments, aren't you? The mirror's surface rippled, and new words appeared. The proud cat must praise what he scorns. Compliments, I repeated, my voice climbing to a near squeak. I have to give genuine compliments to break this curse. 3 of them, apparently, Miriam confirmed, looking entirely too pleased with this turn of events, along with a few other requirements. How perfectly humiliating for someone of your temperament. I wanted to argue, to insist that there had to be another way, but the mirror was already showing me more. Seek the reflection that shows false truths, win favor from the cast-off and forgotten, speak praise with a sincere heart before the witching hour claims the night. Before midnight, I whispered, the full weight of my situation finally sinking in. I had perhaps 8 hours to complete a series of tasks that went against every fibre of my being. Find a lying reflection, whatever that meant. Get help from some kind of misfit. And worst of all, give 3 genuine compliments. The thought made my stuffing feel queasy. "The clock is ticking, little plush cat," Miriam said, her voice carrying genuine amusement. "And pride, as they say, goeth before the fall. Or, in your case, before being stuck as a children's toy forever." I looked around at the maze of mirrors, each one showing a different version of my predicament. In some I was still plush. In others I was normal, but somehow diminished. One particularly disturbing mirror showed me in a shop window with a price tag. "There has to be another way," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Oh, but there is," Miriam replied silkily. "You could simply ask your witch for help. I'm sure Marnie would be delighted to assist with the curse-breaking process." The suggestion hit me like a cold bucket of enchanted water. Ask Marnie for help? Admit that I needed her assistance to fix a problem that was technically my own fault for mocking her spell in the first place? The thought was almost more humiliating than the plush transformation itself. "Absolutely not," I declared. "I will handle this myself."
"Pride," Miriam observed, "is such a wonderfully self-defeating emotion. Good luck, little cat. Do try not to get caught by any small children who might mistake you for a toy." I turned to leave, my mind already working on how to tackle the mirror's requirements, when her voice stopped me at the door.
"Oh, and Whiskers, that mirror you just consulted, it only tells lies." I froze, my bells chiming a discordant note of confusion. "What do you mean it only tells lies?"
Exactly what I said. Every word it showed you was the opposite of the truth. Have fun figuring out what that means. The shop door slammed shut behind me with a sound like breaking glass, leaving me standing alone on the sidewalk in a state of complete bewilderment. If the mirror only told lies, then what it had shown me was backwards, which meant I had no idea what I actually needed to do to break this curse.
The familiar fair swirled around me in all its autumn glory. Families laughing, vendors calling out their wares, the distant sound of the costume contest, warm-up activities beginning. Somewhere in that cheerful chaos, Marnie was probably waking up from her nap, ready to start preparing for our grand debut. And here I was, a plush cat with no magic, no clear path forward, and roughly 7 hours to figure out how to reverse a curse using information that was guaranteed to be completely wrong. My bells chimed nervously as I waddled back toward the main fairgrounds, determined to solve this puzzle before Marnie discovered I was missing. The crowd was thickening as the afternoon wore on, and I spotted what looked like a narrow alley between 2 particularly gothic houses, exactly the kind of place where displaced familiars might gather.
Chapter 4. The House of Misfit Familiars. I woke from my pre-fair nap and stretched, checking the enchanted clock on my nightstand. 3:30. Perfect timing to start getting ready for the costume contest. "Whiskers!" I called out, padding toward the stairs. "Time to wake up. We need to start preparing for tonight." Silence. "Whiskers?" I hurried downstairs, expecting to find him sulking on his favorite cushion. Instead, I found only an empty velvet pillow and that particular stillness that meant trouble. I checked behind the bookshelf, under the kitchen table, in the laundry basket. Nothing. Even his favorite spot by the window was abandoned. Whiskers? This isn't funny. The house felt wrong without his grumpy commentary or the soft jingling of his bells. I grabbed my emergency tracking crystal from the kitchen drawer and held it up. The rose quartz sphere immediately began pulsing with pink light, pointing toward the front door. He'd gone outside, alone, as a plush toy. Oh, Whiskers. I grabbed my autumn cloak and followed the crystal's guidance. The tracking crystal led me through the bustling fair grounds, past families with caramel apples and kids getting their faces painted. I waved at neighbors but kept following the crystal's increasingly urgent pulsing. The trail wound away from the main festivities, down quiet side streets where Victorian mansions sat next to fairy tale cottages. Gardens bloomed out of season, and lawn ornaments watched me pass with definitely alive eyes. The crystal blazed brighter as I approached a narrow alley. A hand-painted sign hung from a wrought iron post. Madame Corvina's Sanctuary for Displaced Familiars, by appointment only. My stomach dropped. Displaced familiars meant abandoned familiars. I hurried toward a cottage that looked assembled from spare house parts. Steep roof, black shingles like raven feathers, mismatched windows. Some round, some square, one shaped like a crescent moon. Before I could knock, the purple door swung open. A woman appeared, about 60, steel-gray hair braided with tiny silver bells, kind eyes with a hint of mischief. Her blue wool dress had embroidered stars that twinkled as she moved. But what made me stare were the familiars everywhere. A three-legged raven on her shoulder, preening proudly. A cat with mismatched eyes lounging in a chair. A ferret with tiny spectacles peering from behind books. In the corner, a gray rat played chess with a monocled toad. Tiny dragons sang from a terrarium. "You must be Marnie Spellwood," she said, her voice warm but sad. "I've been expecting you." Expecting me? I clutched the crystal tighter. "Is Whiskers here?" "My familiar? He's been transformed, and he's here. And he's not lost, dear. He's been surrendered." The word hit me like a failed spell. Surrendered? What do you mean? She gestured me inside. "Come in. We need to talk." Inside, familiars covered every surface, some missing limbs, others bearing scars, a few flickering in and out of visibility, but they all looked content. Loved. "This is a sanctuary," Madame Corvina said, settling into an armchair that attracted 3 cats and a small dragon. "I take in familiars who've been abandoned or rejected. They come when they have nowhere else." "But Whiskers hasn't been abandoned. I would never—" "He's my partner, my best friend." "Is he?" She pointed toward a corner where Whiskers sat talking to a rabbit with tiny antlers. "He came about an hour ago, looking distressed. Said his witch transformed him without consent and paraded him around like a trophy. Said he felt like a thing instead of a being." Watching him, I could see the dejected slump of his shoulders, how his proud posture had deflated. The rabbit nodded sympathetically, patting his felt paw. "He asked if I'd take him in. Said his witch didn't listen anymore, didn't care about his feelings. He was convinced you'd be happier with a more cooperative familiar." "That's not true. I love Whiskers. He's the most important thing in my life." "Then perhaps you should tell him that. Because right now, that cat believes he's nothing more than a magical accessory." I started toward him, but her gentle hand stopped me. "I have a policy about surrendered familiars. They must choose their own fate. If Whiskers truly wants to stay, I can't force him to leave. But he's my familiar. We have a bond. Bonds can be broken, and they can be damaged by neglect, even unintentional neglect." Her eyes were kind but firm. "If you want him back, you'll need to convince him you truly see him as a partner, not a pet." She reached into a cabinet and pulled out a plate of cookies that smelled like cinnamon and honesty. Truth cookies. They compel the eater to speak only what's in their heart for the next hour. Perhaps it's time for honest conversation. I took the plate with shaking hands, terrified of what Whiskers might say without his usual filters, but I had to try. "Whiskers?" I approached his corner, my voice smaller than intended. "Could we talk?" He looked up with his jack-o'-lantern face, and I saw something heartbreaking in those triangle eyes. "I suppose, though I'm not sure what there is to discuss. You have a fair to prepare for, and I have a new home to consider. Please." I held out the truth cookies. Let me try to explain. Let me understand. He hesitated, then selected a small pumpkin-shaped cookie. I took one too. We ate in silence while Madame Corvina's other familiars pretended not to watch. The magic took effect immediately, a warm tingling that unlocked something in my chest. "I'm sorry," I said, and the words felt heavier than usual, weighted with complete honesty. "I'm so sorry, Whiskers. I got excited about the contest and showing off. I forgot to ask what you wanted. I forgot to listen." His bells chimed softly with surprise. "You heard me protesting?" "Of course I heard you. I always hear you." The truth magic pulled words I'd never admitted out loud. "But I thought you were just being stubborn. I thought once everyone loved your transformation, you'd be happy. I thought I was doing something wonderful for both of us." "You were doing something wonderful for you," he said without anger, just exhaustion. "I became a prop in your magic show, Marnie. A cute accessory to make people admire your spell work. Do you know how humiliating it was to be petted and cooed over like a toy while you discussed my transformation with strangers?" The words hit like a slap. I didn't think about it like that. I was so proud of the magic. Everyone was so impressed. I trailed off because I couldn't lie anymore. I thought about how it made me look, not how it made you feel. "Exactly." He sighed, a soft squeak. "And this isn't the first time. The singing food bowl, the collar that translated my thoughts into sonnets, the color-changing fur." Memories flooded back. Incidents I'd thought were harmless experiments, but seeing them through his eyes, each one was a moment I'd prioritized my magical curiosity over his dignity. "You think I don't respect you? I think you love me, but I don't think you see me as an equal partner. I think you see me as a beloved pet who can talk." The truth was devastating. I thought about today, showing off his transformation like a clever trick, discussing spell mechanics while he stood there unable to protest, carrying him around instead of asking if he wanted to walk. "I do see you as an equal," I started, then felt the truth magic's correction. "No, that's not true. I want to see you as an equal, but I don't know how. I've never had a familiar before you. I've been making it up as I go, and I've been doing it wrong." Whiskers stayed quiet, his orange plush form still. Around us, Madame Corvina's other familiars settled into respectful silence, though the rabbit gave him an encouraging nod. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "How can I fix this?" "I want you to ask before you cast spells on me. I want you to listen when I say something makes me uncomfortable. I want to be your partner in your magical work, not just the recipient of it. And I want you to come home. I want to learn how to be the witch you deserve. I want to earn back your trust." His bells chimed uncertainly. "I don't know if I can trust you not to turn me into a decorative object again the next time you get excited about a spell." "Then let me prove it to you. Help me break this transformation curse properly, as partners. Let me show you I can put your needs first." For the first time since I'd arrived, Whiskers looked at me with something other than resignation. "You want to break the curse? Even though it means you can't enter the contest?" "The contest doesn't matter. You matter. Our partnership matters. Everything else is just sparkly nonsense." A slow smile seemed to creep into his triangle eyes. "Well, I suppose I could help with the curse-breaking process. I do have some experience with magical theory." "You do. We make a good team when we actually work together." Madame Corvina cleared her throat gently. "It seems you two have work to do together. Whiskers, are you ready to go home?" He looked around at the cottage full of misfit familiars, then back at me. "I think so. But Marnie, this is your last chance. If you ever treat me like a magical accessory again—" "I won't. And if I start to, you have permission to knock every breakable object in the house off the nearest high surface. Deal. His bells chimed like laughter. As we prepared to leave, I looked around at all these familiars who'd been abandoned or mistreated, finding comfort with someone who understood their worth. Thank you, I told Madame Corvina, for taking care of him and for helping me understand. Take care of each other. And remember, the strongest magic comes from true partnership, not from one person casting spells on another. Walking home through the golden afternoon light, Whiskers rode on my shoulder by his own choice rather than because I'd picked him up. I felt like I was seeing our relationship clearly for the first time. I was shocked at how badly I'd been failing him, but also relieved. Now I knew how to do better.
Chapter 5.
The compliment crisis. Walking back through the fair with Marnie felt different, better, despite my continued plush predicament. She let me ride on her shoulder instead of carrying me like a stuffed animal, and she actually asked my opinion about which booth to visit first. Small thing, but it meant everything. "So tell me about this mirror," Marnie said as we approached the main thoroughfare where evening festivities were ramping up. "What exactly did it say?" I filled her in on my disastrous visit to Miriam Blackglass, including the crucial detail that the mirror only told lies. Marnie listened with the focused attention she usually reserved for tricky spellwork, asking questions that showed she was taking my experience seriously. "If the mirror said you needed 3 compliments, and it only tells lies..." She frowned in concentration. "Then presumably I need to do the opposite of giving compliments, though what the opposite of a compliment is, I'm not certain. Insults? That seems counterproductive to breaking a curse. Unless..." Her eyes lit up. "What if the mirror showed you the truth backwards? Not the opposite action, but the same action with reversed intent."
I considered this as we paused near the enchanted carousel, where painted horses galloped through the air while their riders squealed with delight. "You mean I do need to give compliments, but for the opposite reason than what the mirror suggested?"
Exactly. The mirror said you had to praise what you scorned, right? But what if the real requirement is that you have to praise things sincerely without scorning them at all? Unsettling thought. My entire personality was built on well-crafted disdain and superior observation. Asking me to give genuine compliments was like asking a fish to appreciate the desert. "That's terrifying," I said, my bells jingling, with what I hoped was thoughtful consideration rather than panic. "But it makes sense. Curses usually require personal growth to break, especially self-inflicted ones. And your biggest character flaw, no offense,
None taken. Continue.
is that you're so focused on criticizing everything that you never acknowledge what's actually good about the world around you. Maybe the curse is forcing you to practice genuine appreciation." I wanted to argue, but the theory had an uncomfortable ring of truth to it. Plus, we were running out of time. The sun was already beginning to set, painting the fair in shades of amber and gold, and I could feel the midnight deadline pressing against my consciousness like a weight. "Fine," I said, with as much dignity as my squeaky voice could muster. "But I'm going to need practice, and possibly moral support. This goes against every instinct I have." "I'll help," Marnie promised. "We'll start small and work our way up to the big ones." We began with the carousel operator, a cheerful woman named Ms. Brightwater, who was currently coaxing a particularly stubborn painted unicorn back into formation. "Go on," Marnie whispered. "Say something nice about her carousel management skills."
I studied Ms. Brightwater as she worked, looking for something genuinely praiseworthy that wouldn't make me feel like I was betraying my fundamental nature. She moved with practiced efficiency, her hands gentle with the enchanted animals, her voice calm and encouraging, even when dealing with a unicorn that was clearly having artistic differences with the whole circular motion concept.
"Ms. Brightwater," I called out, my voice carrying farther than I'd expected. "Your patience with that unicorn is quite... The words stuck in my throat like badly swallowed hairballs. Ms. Brightwater looked over at us with a friendly smile, clearly waiting for me to finish the sentence, but my vocal cords seemed to have developed a sudden case of paralysis. "Quite remarkable," I finally managed to squeak out, though it sounded like the words had been physically wrestled from my throat. Ms. Brightwater beamed. "Why, thank you, little one. Starlight here just has strong opinions about artistic expression. Don't you, girl?" The unicorn whinnied in what sounded like agreement, then settled into the carousel pattern with obvious satisfaction. I felt a strange, warm sensation in my chest, as if the compliment had somehow unlocked something that had been tightly closed. "That wasn't so bad," Marnie murmured encouragingly. "It felt like swallowing a sea urchin," I replied, but I had to admit there was something oddly satisfying about the way Ms. Brightwater's face had lit up. "Let's try another one before I lose my nerve." Our next target was Mr. Grimsby, who was stationed at his cursed antiques booth, looking even more sour than usual. A family with 3 small children was examining his collection of haunted music boxes, and he was doing his best to discourage their interest with dire warnings about supernatural consequences. "Perfect," Marnie whispered. "He needs all the positivity he can get." I studied the grumpy antique dealer, searching for something genuinely commendable about his approach. It would have been easy to make a sarcastic comment about his customer service skills, but that wasn't what we were going for here. "Mr. Grimsby," I called out as the family moved on to a less ominous booth. "Your commitment to honestly informing customers about the risks of cursed objects is actually quite admirable." He looked around in confusion until he spotted me perched on Marnie's shoulder. "Whiskers? Did you just compliment my business practices?" "I did." The words came easier this time, probably because they were completely true. Most merchants would hide the supernatural side effects to make a sale. You prioritize customer safety over profit.
A slow, genuine smile spread across Mr. Grimsby's weathered face. "Well, I'll be hexed. Thank you, lad. That means more than you know." As we walked away, I noticed that the haunted music boxes in his display were playing slightly cheerier tunes, and there was definitely more bounce in his step.
"Two down," Marnie said quietly. "How are you feeling?" "Confused," I admitted, "and slightly nauseous. But also—" I paused, trying to identify the unfamiliar sensation spreading through my stuffed chest. "Oddly satisfied? Is that normal?" "Completely normal. You're discovering that making people happy actually feels good." "A disturbing development," I muttered, but without real conviction. For our third attempt, we approached Mrs. Chen's kettle corn stand, where she was currently dealing with a minor magical malfunction that had turned her latest batch purple and given it the ability to levitate. "Oh, this is perfect," Marnie whispered. "She's having corn troubles." I watched Mrs. Chen as she good-naturedly chased floating purple kernels around her booth, apologizing to customers while simultaneously trying to figure out what had gone wrong with her heating spell. Her 2 teenage daughters were helping, one armed with a butterfly net and the other consulting a thick manual titled Emergency Confection Corrections. "Mrs. Chen," I called out, and she paused in her kernel chasing to look over at us. "Your ability to maintain such good humor while dealing with magical kitchen disasters is truly impressive." She laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a summer breeze. "Oh, Whiskers! When you've been making magical snacks for 20 years, you learn to roll with the punches. Besides, look at this." She gestured at the floating corn with obvious delight. "I may have accidentally invented anti-gravity popcorn. That's got to be worth something at the innovation competition." "See?" I continued, feeling more confident now. "That's exactly what I mean. You turn problems into opportunities. It's quite inspiring, actually." Mrs. Chen's smile could have powered the entire fair's lighting system. "You're such a sweet little familiar. Marnie, you're so lucky to have him." As we moved away from the kettle corn stand, now featuring a sign advertising levitation corn, a gravity-defying snack experience, I realized something odd was happening. Each genuine compliment seemed to make the warm sensation in my chest stronger, and more importantly, I was starting to notice positive things about people without having to search for them. "This is deeply unsettling," I told Marnie as we paused near the dunking booth, where the local librarian was currently trying to hex-proof herself against the water. "I think the compliments are actually changing how I see things." "That's kind of the point of personal growth," she replied gently. "Though I have to say, watching you discover the joy of making people happy is absolutely adorable." "Don't call me adorable while I'm having an existential crisis," I grumbled, but my bells chimed with what sounded distinctly like amusement. We were interrupted by a commotion near the face-painting booth, where a small crowd had gathered around what appeared to be a very distressed golden retriever. The dog was wearing a tiny witch hat and a worried expression, and his human, an elderly man I recognized as Mr. Peterson from the library, was speaking to him in urgent, whispered tones. "What's wrong with Buster?" Marnie asked, approaching the crowd. "Poor thing's been like this all afternoon," explained Mrs. Holloway, who was holding a cotton candy that sparkled with actual stardust. "Ever since he got spooked by something at the enchanted mirror booth. Won't eat, won't play, just keeps whimpering and looking around like he's lost." I studied the distressed dog, noting the way he kept turning his head, as if listening for something only he could hear, the slight tremor in his golden fur, the confused sadness in his dark eyes. Something about his behavior tugged at my memory. I'd seen this before in the sanctuary earlier today. "He's not spooked," I said suddenly. "He's homesick."
Everyone turned to look at me, including Buster, whose ears perked up with interest.
"What do you mean?" Mr. Peterson asked. I thought carefully about my words, wanting to get this right. "I think he saw something in the enchanted mirrors that reminded him of where he came from before you adopted him. Sometimes magical mirrors can trigger memories in animals, especially traumatic ones." Buster let out a soft whine and took a tentative step toward me. "What he needs," I continued, "isn't distraction or treats. He needs reassurance that his current home is his real home, that he's safe and wanted where he is now."
Mr. Peterson's eyes filled with understanding. "Oh, Buster, come here, boy."
He knelt down and wrapped his arms around the golden retriever, speaking softly about car rides to the vet, favorite toys, and the spot by the fireplace that would always be Buster's. Gradually, the dog's trembling stopped, and his tail began a tentative wag. "How did you know that?" Mrs. Holloway asked me, her voice full of genuine curiosity.
I looked at the reunited pair, Mr. Peterson stroking Buster's golden fur, while the dog leaned gratefully into his human's embrace, and felt that warm sensation in my chest expand until it was almost overwhelming.
"Because," I said quietly, "I know what it feels like to be afraid you don't really belong somewhere, and I know how good it feels when someone convinces you that you do." The crowd began to disperse as Buster returned to his normal, tail-wagging self, but I noticed several people giving me thoughtful looks as they walked away. Mrs. Holloway patted my felt head gently before moving on, and Mr. Peterson mouthed, "Thank you," in my direction. "Whiskers," Marnie said softly, as we found a quiet spot near the wishing well. "That wasn't just a compliment. That was genuine wisdom and kindness." "I know," I replied, and for the first time all day, my voice carried no trace of irritation or superiority. It's terrifying. But as I sat there on Marnie's shoulder, watching the fair continue around us, families laughing, friends sharing treats, neighbors helping neighbors with minor magical mishaps, I realized that the terror was mixed with something else. Hope, maybe. Or belonging. Or perhaps just the quiet satisfaction of discovering that there was more to the world than I'd been willing to see before. My bells chimed a soft, contemplative melody as the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, and I found myself feeling something I'd never experienced before, desperately curious about what else I might have been missing all these years, and slightly humbled by the possibility that there was still so much to learn.
Chapter 6.
Fair games and failing charades. By the time the sun began to set behind the enchanted Ferris wheel, painting everything in amber and rose gold, the familiar fair had transformed into something truly magical. Strings of fairy lights twinkled between booths like captured stars. Jack-o'-lanterns floated overhead in lazy processions, and the air hummed with anticipatory energy. I should have been in my element. This was exactly the kind of event I'd been dreaming about all year, the chance to show off my magical skills, to finally win something, to be the witch everyone was talking about for all the right reasons. Instead, I was standing at the edge of the main performance area, clutching my transformed familiar and fighting a growing sense of panic about everything that could go wrong. The costume contest starts in 15 minutes. I murmured to Whiskers, who was perched on my shoulder surveying the crowd with what I was learning to recognize as his plotting something expression. "Are you sure you want to do this? We could still withdraw." "Absolutely not," he replied firmly. "We've come this far, and besides, I have a theory about the curse-breaking requirements that I'd like to test." "What kind of theory?" I asked, though I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to know. Whiskers' theories had a tendency to involve dramatic gestures and what he called calculated chaos. The mirror mentioned something about a reflection that lies and a misfit's favor, remember? Well, I think I've figured out what both of those mean. His bells chimed with what sounded distinctly like mischief, but I'll need to cause a bit of a scene to make it work. Before I could ask for clarification, Mrs. Holloway's voice rang out over the crowd through a magically amplified speaking cone. "Ladies and gentlemen, witches and warlocks, magical beings of all kinds, welcome to the annual Familiar Fair Costume Contest." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, and I felt my stomach do several impressive loop-de-loops. Around us, other contestants were making final preparations, adjusting costumes, practicing presentation speeches, casting last-minute glamour spells to ensure their familiars looked their absolute best. "First up," Mrs. Holloway announced, "we have Harold Grimsby and his raven Edgar, dressed as— oh my, is that a tiny Edgar Allan Poe costume?" I watched in fascination as Mr. Grimsby took the stage with Edgar perched proudly on his shoulder. The raven was indeed wearing a miniature version of Victorian formal wear, complete with a tiny cravat and what appeared to be a very small quill pen clutched in one talon. They performed a brief dramatic reading from The Raven that had the audience both laughing and applauding appreciatively. "That's actually quite clever," I admitted grudgingly. "It is," Whiskers agreed, "though I notice Edgar seems to be enjoying himself immensely. Look at how he's preening for the audience." He was right. The raven was clearly reveling in the attention, even going so far as to take a small bow at the end of their performance. It was the kind of natural showmanship that I'd always assumed Whiskers possessed but had never actually bothered to confirm. "Next," Mrs. Holloway called out, "we have the Blackthorn twins and their ferrets, Castor and Pollux, in a delightful interpretation of The Wizard of Oz." The twins took the stage with their ferrets dressed as Dorothy and the Cowardly Lion, complete with tiny ruby slippers and a magnificent mane made of enchanted yarn. The performance involved the ferrets skipping down a miniature yellow brick road while the twins provided magical special effects: sparkling tornadoes, emerald lighting, and what appeared to be actual flying monkeys the size of hummingbirds. "Oh, that's lovely," I breathed, genuinely impressed despite my nerves. "It is," Whiskers said, but I noticed his voice had taken on a slightly strained quality. "Marnie, I need to tell you something before we go on stage." "What is it?" I may have exaggerated my enthusiasm for this whole contest thing, he admitted. "The truth is, I'm absolutely terrified of making a fool of myself in front of the entire town." I blinked in surprise. But you're always so confident, so sure of yourself. That's because I usually have control over the situation, he replied, his orange plush form somehow managing to convey deep anxiety despite the permanent jack-o'-lantern grin. Right now, I'm a stuffed animal with bells who squeaks when he talks. The potential for humiliation is astronomical. Looking at him, really looking at him, I could see the tension in his small shoulders, the way his usually proud posture had deflated slightly. For all his complaints about the transformation, he'd been trying to be brave about this whole ordeal, and I'd been so focused on my own excitement that I'd missed his fear. "We don't have to do this," I said immediately. "Seriously, Whiskers, the contest doesn't matter. Your comfort matters." "No, we do have to do this," he said firmly. "Not for the contest, but for the curse. I'm almost certain that the final requirements involve some kind of public acknowledgement of, well, of things I'm not particularly good at acknowledging." Before I could ask what he meant, Mrs. Holloway was calling our names. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have Marnie Spellwood and her magnificent familiar, Whiskers, in what appears to be, oh my, Whiskers. Is that a pumpkin head? How absolutely precious. The crowd's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Ahs and coos and delighted laughter that made my cheeks flush with pride and made Whiskers go very still on my shoulder. "Showtime," he murmured, and I could hear the effort it took for him to keep his voice steady. We made our way onto the stage where a small spotlight made Whiskers' orange felt gleam like real pumpkin skin. The audience was already charmed. I could see it in their faces, the way they leaned forward to get a better look, the phones coming out to capture pictures of my adorable transformed familiar. "Tell us about your costume," Mrs. Holloway prompted cheerfully. I launched into the explanation I'd been practicing, the technical aspects of the transformation spell, the seasonal magic theory, the emotional resonance enchantments that made his bells respond to his feelings. The audience listened with fascination, and I could feel that familiar rush of pride at being the center of attention, at having everyone admire my magical handiwork. "And Whiskers," Mrs. Holloway said, turning to address my familiar directly, "how do you feel about your new look?" This was the moment I'd been dreading. I held my breath, hoping Whiskers would play along, would give some charming answer that would seal our victory. Instead, he was silent for a long moment. Then his bells began to chime. Not the cheerful tinkling I'd expected, but a discordant, agitated melody that sounded like the musical equivalent of barely contained panic. He started, then stopped. The bells chimed again, more urgently this time. The audience waited expectantly, their smiles beginning to fade into concern as the silence stretched on. "Whiskers?" I whispered. "Are you okay?" Instead of answering, he did something completely unexpected. He began to struggle violently in my arms, his plush body writhing with obvious distress. The bells around his neck rang out in what could only be described as alarm bells, their magical resonance picking up his emotional state and amplifying it until the sound was almost painful. "Whiskers!" I exclaimed, trying to calm him, but he was having none of it. What happened next was pure chaos. Whiskers somehow managed to launch himself from my shoulder toward the backdrop of the stage, a beautiful autumn scene painted on enchanted canvas that shifted and moved like a living landscape. As he collided with it, his bells released a burst of magical feedback that sent the painted leaves swirling out of their designated areas and into the air above the audience. The crowd gasped and ducked as autumn leaves the size of dinner plates began raining down on them, followed by painted pumpkins that bounced harmlessly but enthusiastically off people's heads. A flock of painted geese broke free from their formation and began honking indignantly as they flew in confused circles around the performance area. "I'm sorry. I called out to the audience, trying to catch the wayward leaves while simultaneously chasing after my transformed familiar, who was now burrowing determinedly into a pile of stage props. This isn't part of the act. Whiskers, what are you doing? He emerged from the props wearing what appeared to be a tiny pilgrim hat from last year's Thanksgiving display and dragging a miniature cornucopia that was spilling enchanted candy corn across the stage. Making a point, he declared, his squeaky voice somehow carrying over the chaos. This is exactly what I was afraid of. Being put on display like a performing monkey while everyone coos over how cute I am without anyone asking what I actually want. The painted geese chose that moment to collide with the main stage lighting, sending sparkles of rainbow light cascading down like magical confetti. A painted scarecrow had somehow come to life and was wandering around the stage looking confused and asking if anyone had seen his field. Whiskers, I said, finally managing to corner him near the judge's table. I know this is scary, but it's not scary, he interrupted, and his bells chimed with what sounded like desperate honesty. It's lonely. I'm standing here in front of the entire town, and everyone is looking at me, and none of them are seeing me. They're seeing a cute costume, a clever spell, a adorable little prop in Marnie Spellwood's magical display. The chaos around us was starting to settle. The painted elements were being corralled by helpful volunteers, and the confused scarecrow had been gently escorted off stage. But the audience was completely focused on our drama unfolding in real time. And the worst part, Whiskers continued, his voice cracking slightly, is that part of me wants to just play along, to be the charming, adorable familiar who makes everyone happy and wins the contest. Because at least then I'd belong somewhere, even if it meant giving up everything that makes me, me. The raw honesty in his voice hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't about the costume contest at all. This was about our entire relationship, about all the ways I'd made him feel like he had to choose between being himself and being loved. I knelt down on the stage so we were at eye level, not caring that the entire town was watching our private moment unfold in public. Whiskers, I said softly, what do you need from me right now? Not as your witch, not as a contestant in this contest, but as your friend. What do you need? He looked at me with his triangle jack-o'-lantern eyes, and for a moment I could swear I saw tears gathering in their painted depths. I need you to tell me that you see me, he said quietly. Not the transformation, not the cute factor, not the way I make your magic look good. Just me. Grumpy, sarcastic, overthinking, occasionally wise me. The words came easier than I'd expected, probably because they were completely true. I see you, I said clearly, my voice carrying across the silent performance area. I see Whiskers McGrumpy Whiskers, who knows exactly how to comfort a scared dog because he understands what it feels like to be afraid of not belonging. I see the familiar who gives the best advice even when he's pretending to be above it all. I see my partner, who's been trying to take care of me even while I was making him miserable. His bells chimed softly, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. I see someone brave enough to call me out when I'm being thoughtless, and patient enough to let me learn how to do better. I see the person who makes me want to be a better witch, not because he demands it, but because he deserves it. And, I added, reaching out to gently adjust the tiny pilgrim hat that was still perched comically on his pumpkin head, I see someone who's been carrying around way too much responsibility for making everyone else comfortable, when what he really needs is for someone to make sure he's comfortable too. Whiskers was quiet for a long moment, his plush form very still. Then, to my complete surprise, he began what could only be described as an interpretive dance. It started as a simple swaying motion, his stubby arms moving in graceful arcs while his bells chimed a melody that sounded like gratitude mixed with relief. Then he began to spin, his orange form twirling across the stage in movements that were part celebration, part emotional release, and part the most ridiculous thing I'd ever seen. The audience, who had been watching our conversation with the rapt attention usually reserved for particularly good theater, burst into spontaneous applause. But this time, I noticed, they weren't just clapping for the cute factor. They were applauding the emotion, the honesty, the raw courage it had taken for both of us to have that conversation in public. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Holloway announced, her voice warm with genuine feeling, "I think we've just witnessed something truly special. Not just a costume, but a real partnership in action." As the applause continued, Whiskers finished his interpretive dance with a theatrical bow that somehow managed to be both dignified and completely absurd. The pilgrim hat fell off his head and rolled across the stage, and he looked up at me with an expression that I could only describe as cautiously hopeful. "So," he said, his voice still squeaky but somehow carrying more confidence than it had all day, "how do you think we did?" I looked out at the audience, at Mrs. Holloway dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, at Mr. Grimsby nodding approvingly, at families and neighbors who were looking at us with genuine warmth and respect, rather than just surface-level amusement. "I think," I said, scooping him up and settling him on my shoulder, "we finally figured out what we were actually competing for." As we left the stage to make room for the next contestants, I felt a shift in the bond between us, something deeper and more solid than it had been before. We still had a curse to break, and less than 5 hours until midnight, but for the first time all day, I felt like we were truly working together. And judging by the way Whiskers was humming along with his own bells, I think he felt it too. The guilt I'd been carrying all day was finally starting to transform into something more useful. Clarity about what kind of partnership we both actually wanted, and determination to build it together.
Chapter 7. Midnight Magic. The town clock was chiming 11:30 when I finally understood what the lying mirror had actually been trying to tell me. Marnie and I had retreated to a quiet corner near the wishing well after our dramatic stage debut, partly to decompress and partly to figure out how to tackle the final hour of curse-breaking. The fair continued around us, couples sharing candied apples that sparkled with edible starlight, children running between booths with bags of enchanted treats, the distant sound of the dunking booth where someone had charmed the water to sparkle like liquid diamonds. "So," Marnie said, settling cross-legged on the grass beside the well, while I perched on its stone edge. "Let's work through this logically. The mirror said you needed 3 compliments, a reflection that lies, and a misfits favor. All of which it told me backwards," I reminded her, my bells chiming thoughtfully. "So the real requirements are probably the opposite of what it showed me." "Right. So maybe instead of 3 compliments, you need to receive 3 compliments, and instead of giving a misfit favor, you need to receive 1.
I considered this, watching the fairy lights twinkle in the trees around us. That would make sense, except I've been giving compliments all evening, and it felt like progress. Plus, there's the issue of the reflection that lies.
What if the lying mirror was literally one of the requirements? You consulted a reflection that only told lies. That's the first requirement checked off. A warm sensation spread through my plush chest as the pieces began clicking into place. "And the misfits favor. Madame Corvina, she helped you understand what I needed, even though I was technically a displaced familiar in her care." "Which means the only requirement left is the compliments," Marnie said excitedly. "But what kind of compliments, and from whom?" "Excuse me," came a soft, slightly nervous voice. "Are you Whiskers?" We turned to find a young woman I didn't recognize, perhaps in her early 20s, with curly auburn hair crowned by a wreath of autumn leaves and kind brown eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. She was holding the hand of what appeared to be a very small dragon, though it might have been a particularly large lizard wearing tiny spectacles of its own. "I am," I said cautiously. And you are?
Luna Brightstar, she said, her cheeks flushing pink. I'm Madame Corvina's apprentice. This is Pip. She gestured to the dragon lizard, who waved one tiny claw in greeting. We were at the costume contest earlier, and we wanted to tell you something. Luna knelt down so she was closer to my eye level, her expression earnest. What you did up there tonight, the way you were brave enough to show your real self instead of hiding behind masks, that helped us see ourselves clearly too. I felt the first shimmer of golden sparks begin to dance around my plush form, faint but unmistakable. I'm not sure I understand.
You stopped seeing yourself through a distorted reflection, Luna continued, her voice growing more confident. Instead of believing you were just a grumpy, difficult familiar, you let everyone see that you're actually wise in ways that matter. You understand things about belonging and authenticity that most people never figure out. That's a true reflection, not the lies we tell ourselves about who we are. The golden sparks intensified, swirling around my orange felt form. I could feel something shifting inside me, like ice melting, some fundamental change that went deeper than just magical transformation. Pip nodded vigorously, his tiny spectacles glinting. "And your humour," he squeaked, in a voice like wind chimes. "It's not mean funny or sarcastic to hurt people funny, but clever funny, the kind that makes people feel included instead of excluded. You made us feel like we belonged, even though we're different." More golden sparks, these ones brighter and warmer. The air around us began to shimmer with magical energy, and I realized that these weren't just compliments, they were something much more profound. "We're misfits too," Luna added quietly. "Pip and we've both felt like outsiders, like we had to choose between being ourselves and being accepted. But watching you refuse to make that choice, watching you insist on being seen for who you really are, that gave us permission to do the same."
I felt my breath catch. You're saying I helped you feel less alone?
"More than that," Luna said, reaching out to gently touch one of my felt paws. "You showed us what real acceptance looks like. Not the kind where people love you despite your flaws, but the kind where they love you including your flaws. That's rare and precious, and exactly the kind of magic this world needs more of." The golden sparks exploded outward in a burst of light so bright that several nearby fairgoers stopped to stare. I felt my plush form beginning to tingle and shift, the felt loosening, the stuffing redistributing, the permanent jack-o'-lantern grin finally starting to fade. But more than the physical transformation, I felt something click into place in my mind, a sudden, crystal-clear understanding. "The mirror's riddle wasn't about tasks to complete," I said in wonder, my voice already beginning to deepen back to its normal register. "It was about experiences to allow. I had to let myself be seen clearly, accepted fully, and loved authentically." "What do you mean?" Marnie asked, watching in fascination as my familiar black fur began to emerge from beneath the orange felt. "The reflection that lies..." That was about seeing myself through honest eyes instead of my own distorted self-perception. The misfits' favor, that was about being accepted by someone who understands feeling different. And the 3 words of praise. I looked at Luna and Pip, who were watching my transformation with obvious delight. That was about experiencing unconditional acceptance. As the last of the plush magic faded away, I found myself sitting on the edge of the wishing well in my natural feline form, though I was still wearing the tiny bell collar from the costume. My fur was its usual sleek black, my eyes their familiar green, my tail switching with its characteristic mixture of dignity and barely contained mischief. But something was different. I felt lighter somehow. Less burdened by the need to maintain my superiority, more open to the possibility that there were people in the world who might see my flaws and choose to appreciate me anyway. "Well," I said, testing my voice and finding it back to its normal sardonic purr, "that was certainly an educational experience." Marnie laughed and reached out to scratch behind my ears, then stopped and looked at me questioningly. Is this okay? It's perfect, I said, and meant it completely. Though perhaps we could discuss your future spellcasting plans before you attempt any more surprise transformations. Absolutely, she promised. From now on, you have veto power over any magic that directly affects you. Luna and Pip were watching our interaction with obvious delight, and I realized that they too were part of the magic that had freed me. Not just their compliments, but their recognition of something in me that I'd never fully seen myself. Thank you, I said to them both, for seeing something worth saving in a grumpy, transformation-cursed familiar. Thank you for showing us that being authentic is always worth the risk, Luna replied.
As they headed back toward the main fair festivities, I turned to Marnie with what I suspected was my first genuinely contented expression of the day.
So, I said, my tail curling around my paws in satisfaction, how do you think we did in the costume contest?
Marnie grinned. I think we won something much better than a ribbon.
The town clock began to chime midnight, its bronze notes ringing out across Gossamer Grove. Around us, the fair was beginning to wind down, families heading home with sleepy children, vendors packing up their magical wares, couples taking one last turn around the enchanted dance floor. Come on, Marnie said, standing and brushing grass from her skirts. Let's go home. I leaped gracefully to her shoulder, my usual perch, but now offered freely rather than assumed. As we walked home through the quiet streets of Gossamer Grove, past houses glowing with warm light and jack-o'-lanterns flickering with the last of their Halloween magic, I reflected on the day's events. My bells, which I'd decided to keep, chimed a soft, satisfied melody as we turned onto our street. I was still grumpy, still sarcastic, still prone to overthinking and the occasional dramatic monologue, but I was also, for the first time in my life, genuinely content with being exactly who I was.
Epilogue. Pumpkin Paws lives on. 3 weeks after the familiar fair, I was arranging a display of my latest batch of shimmer gloss lip balm when Mrs. Moonwhisper burst through the door of Gossamer Grove's premier magical craft shop, Enchanted Creations, clutching what appeared to be a newspaper and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. "Marnie," she called out, practically vibrating with the need to share news. "Have you seen this morning's Gossamer Grove Gazette?" I looked up from my display, a rainbow of lip balms that actually shimmered with captured starlight, and shook my head. "Not yet. I've been here since dawn getting ready for the shop's grand opening. What's got you so excited?" She thrust the newspaper at me, pointing to a headline that made my heart skip several beats. "Local Witch's Pumpkin Paws plushie becomes overnight sensation. Orders pouring in from across the region." "Oh no," I breathed, scanning the article with growing alarm. "Oh no, oh no, oh no." The story, written by the Gazette's enthusiastic lifestyle reporter Melody Starweaver, was accompanied by a large photograph of the plush replica I'd sewn of Whiskers' transformation. It was currently sitting in the window of the craft shop, wearing a tiny witch hat and surrounded by autumn leaves that actually danced when people walked by. "It says here that you've received over 200 orders in the past week alone," Mrs. Moonwhisper said, clearly delighted by this turn of events. "From as far away as the enchanted forest of Whispering Oaks." Melody interviewed at least 6 different customers who said the doll helped their children feel better about being different. I continued reading, my expression growing more horrified by the paragraph. The article quoted Mrs. Holloway saying the plushie was a perfect representation of finding magic in unexpected places. Mr. Grimsby had apparently called it the most emotionally honest children's toy he'd ever encountered. Even the Blackthorn twins had chimed in, describing how the story of Whiskers' transformation had inspired them to be more authentic in their own magical practice. "This is a disaster," I murmured, glancing nervously toward the shop's back room where I could hear the distinctive sound of someone knocking things off shelves. Never a good sign with my familiar. A disaster? Mrs. Moonwhisper looked genuinely confused. But this is wonderful. You're going to be famous. The article says there's already talk of a children's book series. Before I could explain why this was exactly the opposite of wonderful, the sound of approaching footsteps announced Whiskers' arrival from the stockroom. He padded into the main shop area wearing his usual expression of dignified disdain, though I'd learned to read the subtle signs that indicated his mood. Right now, the slight twitching of his whiskers and the way his tail was held just a bit too stiffly suggested he was approximately 30 seconds away from what he called therapeutic property destruction. "Mrs. Moonwhisper," he said with exaggerated politeness, "how lovely to see you. I don't suppose you're here to discuss the absolutely mortifying newspaper article that has turned my temporary magical mishap into a regional phenomenon." "Oh, Whiskers!" Mrs. Moonwhisper clasped her hands together in delight. "You must be so proud. Your little adventure has brought joy to so many families. The article says children from 3 different provinces are sleeping with Pumpkin Paws dolls every night." Whiskers' green eyes took on the particular gleam that usually preceded what he dramatically called the full extent of my displeasure. His tail began to twitch in a rhythm that I'd learned meant someone is about to experience the consequences of their poor life choices. "Proud," he repeated slowly. "Yes, I can think of nothing more fulfilling than having my most humiliating day immortalized in fabric and stuffing for the entertainment of children across the magical territories." I quickly intervened before he could work himself into one of his legendary rants. "Mrs. Chen, would you excuse us for just a moment? I need to discuss some business details with my partner." After she left, still beaming about my entrepreneurial success, I turned to face Whiskers, who was now sitting in the middle of the shop floor wearing an expression that could have frozen the enchanted tea kettle. "Before you say anything," I began quickly, "I want you to know that I had no idea this would happen. I made one replica as a memento of our adventure. I thought it would be sweet." "A memento," Whiskers said, his voice carrying that dangerous calm that meant I was in serious trouble. "Of our adventure. You mean of the day I was transformed into a plush toy against my will, paraded around town like a carnival prize, and forced to confront my deepest insecurities in front of the entire population of Gossamer Grove? Well, when you put it like that, I winced. But Whiskers, read the rest of the article. Look at what people are saying about the story. Children who felt different or misunderstood are finding comfort in the idea that it's okay to be complicated, that being transformed doesn't mean losing who you are." He was quiet for a long moment, his green eyes studying the newspaper article. Finally, he spoke. "Are you telling me that my personal humiliation has somehow become inspirational? I think what I'm telling you is that your courage, the way you refused to pretend to be something you weren't, the way you insisted on being seen for who you really are, has given other people permission to do the same thing." Whiskers padded over to the window display where the plush replica sat in its place of honor. The resemblance was quite good, if I did say so myself. I'd captured the essential charm of his transformed state while somehow also managing to convey a hint of his underlying dignity and intelligence. "It is well crafted," he admitted grudgingly. "The stitching is excellent, and you managed to get the proportions exactly right." "Thank you," I said, feeling a small spark of hope. "And I suppose there is something to be said for the idea that our story might help others feel less alone in their own struggles with authenticity and acceptance." "There is," I agreed carefully, not wanting to push too hard. He was quiet for another moment, then turned to look at me with an expression that was part resignation, part amusement, and part something that might have been pride. "Very well," he said finally, But I have conditions. Name them. First, any profits from this enterprise go into a fund for Madame Corvina's sanctuary. If we're going to capitalize on my temporary transformation, the least we can do is help other displaced familiars. Done, I said immediately. That's actually a wonderful idea. Second, I want it clearly stated in all marketing materials that the real Whiskers is a sophisticated magical, familiar with an extensive vocabulary and strong opinions about proper spellcasting protocols. I will not have children thinking I'm actually as cuddly as that plush version suggests. I can work with that, I agreed, trying not to smile at his wounded dignity. And third, he said, his voice taking on a slightly different quality. I want you to make sure the story emphasizes that the transformation was only temporary, because I had a partner who was willing to listen, learn, and change. The magic wasn't in the curse breaking, it was in the relationship. The warmth in his voice made my chest tight with emotion. I can definitely do that. Just then, the shop door chimed, and Luna Brightstar entered with Pip perched on her shoulder. She was carrying a small canvas bag and wearing the kind of excited expression that usually meant someone was about to make my day much more interesting. "Marnie, Whiskers!" she called out cheerfully. "Perfect timing. I have something for you." She reached into her bag and pulled out what appeared to be a tiny witch hat, perfectly sized for a certain plush familiar. But this wasn't just any hat. It was clearly handmade, stitched with intricate silver thread that caught the light like captured moonbeams. "I wanted to contribute to the Pumpkin Paws collection," she explained, approaching the window display. "This is for the original. I enchanted it with a small blessing. Anyone who sees it will be reminded that magic is strongest when it comes from authentic connection." As she placed the hat on the plush Whiskers' head, the entire display seemed to glow with a warm, welcoming light. The dancing autumn leaves settled into a gentle, rhythmic pattern, and I could swear I heard the faint sound of tiny bells chiming in harmony. "It's perfect," I breathed. "It's tolerable," Whiskers corrected, but I could hear the pleased undertone in his voice. Pip squeaked his approval from Luna's shoulder, then glided down to examine the display more closely. "The real question is," he said in his tiny wind chime voice, "are you prepared for what comes next?" "What do you mean?" I asked. Luna grinned. "Well, according to my sources at the post office, you've already received 3 letters asking about commission transformations, 2 requests for spellcasting tutorials, and 1 very official-looking envelope from the Regional Council of Magical Artisans." I felt my eyes widen. The Regional Council? But that's the professional organization for master-level magical crafters. I'm nowhere near that level. "Maybe not yet," Whiskers said thoughtfully, "but our little adventure has apparently attracted some attention from people who appreciate innovation in familiar witch partnerships." As if summoned by our conversation, Mrs. Moonwhisper reappeared at the shop window, this time accompanied by what appeared to be half the town. Through the glass, I could see Mrs. Holloway, Mr. Grimsby, the Blackthorn twins, and at least a dozen other neighbors, all peering excitedly at the display and chattering among themselves. "Oh dear," I murmured. "I think we're about to have visitors." "Indeed," Whiskers said, settling himself regally beside the cash register. "Well, Marnie, it appears your little craft shop venture is about to become considerably more adventurous than anticipated." I looked around at the shop I'd worked so hard to create, the careful displays of handmade magical items, the cozy seating area where customers could test products, the workshop space in the back where I planned to teach classes, and felt a familiar flutter of nervous excitement. "Are you ready for this?" I asked Whiskers. He considered the question seriously, his green eyes moving from the growing crowd outside to the glowing plush display to my face. "I'm ready for whatever comes next," he said finally, "as long as we face it as partners. Equal partners who discuss magical endeavors before implementing them." Deal, I said, extending my hand for him to shake with his paw. Deal, he agreed. The shop door chimed as our first wave of visitors entered, led by Mrs. Holloway, who was practically bouncing with excitement. "Marnie, dear," she exclaimed, "we simply must hear all about your plans for the Pumpkin Paws collection. And Whiskers, you absolutely must tell us what it was really like being transformed. For the children, you understand. They'll want to know that even magical mishaps can lead to wonderful discoveries." I looked at Whiskers, who looked back at me with an expression that was part exasperation, part amusement, and part genuine warmth. "Well," he said, settling into what I recognized as his storytelling posture, "I suppose it all began with a perfectly reasonable objection to costume contests." As he launched into his version of our adventure, which, knowing Whiskers, would be both dramatically entertaining and surprisingly insightful, I found myself smiling. Yes, my quiet little craft shop had somehow turned into the epicenter of a regional plushie phenomenon. Yes, I was apparently going to have to figure out how to handle custom orders from 3 different provinces, but watching Whiskers hold court in the middle of the shop, regaling our neighbors with tales of magical mishaps and personal growth while maintaining his dignity and wit, I realized that I wouldn't change any of it. As Mrs. Holloway handed me a list of friends from neighboring towns who wanted to place orders, and Mr. Grimsby mentioned that he might be interested in selling complimentary cursed accessories, I felt that familiar mixture of excitement and mild panic that seemed to define life in Gossamer Grove. "Whiskers?" I said quietly while our visitors examined the merchandise. "I think we're going to need a bigger shop." "Indeed," he replied, his whiskers twitching with what I'd learned to recognize as anticipatory mischief. "But first, we're going to need a much more organized filing system. I refuse to let our newfound success turn into administrative chaos." "Of course," I agreed. "We'll start with proper record keeping and a customer service protocol that maintains appropriate boundaries while still being welcoming." "Absolutely." "And perhaps," he added with the kind of smile that usually preceded his most outrageous suggestions, "we should consider expanding into seasonal collections. Christmas whiskers? Anyone? Easter whiskers? I could be the first familiar to achieve true multimedia representation." I stared at him, not entirely sure if he was joking. "Kidding," he said quickly, though his eyes were sparkling with mischief. "Though I do think we should seriously consider that children's book series. I have some ideas about proper familiar representation in literature." As the afternoon wore on and our impromptu shop opening turned into a full-fledged community celebration, I found myself thinking about how much had changed since that morning 3 weeks ago when I'd been so excited about a simple costume contest. I'd gained a real partnership with my familiar, discovered a talent for magical crafting that people actually valued, and somehow stumbled into what looked like it might become a genuine business venture. As the sun set over Gossamer Grove and our last visitors finally headed home, I looked around the shop, now slightly disheveled but glowing with the warm energy of a day well spent, and felt deeply, genuinely content. "So," Whiskers said, settling onto his favorite perch behind the counter, "what do you think? Ready for whatever magical adventure comes next?" I looked at him, still grumpy, still sarcastic, still prone to knocking things off shelves when he was annoyed, but now sitting in our shop like he belonged there, like we belonged together. "You know what?" I said, straightening a display of mood-responsive candles that had started flickering pink with contentment. "I think we make a pretty good team." "Obviously," he replied with characteristic smugness, "though I do hope our next adventure involves fewer costume contests and more reasonable working hours."
Thank you for listening. Please visit me at winvalentine.com to stay up to date. Please subscribe, leave a comment, and review.